The howling wind rattled the windows of Eleanor Harrington's small cabin as the first pain shot through her abdomen. Her hands clutched her swollen belly, her wedding band gleaming in the firelight, a bittersweet reminder of her husband Thomas, who'd been laid to rest just 4 months earlier. Outside, the Montana winter of 1879 had unleashed its fury, burying Montana City under the worst blizzard anyone could remember. "Not now," Eleanor whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the chilled air of her bedroom. "Please, not during this storm." But her unborn child had other plans. Another contraction seized her, stronger than the first. Eleanor gripped the bedpost, mentally calculating the distance to Dr. Morrison's office on the other side of town. It might as well have been 100 miles with 3 feet of snow and more falling by the minute. Eleanor, 26 and widowed too young, had moved west with Thomas 2 years earlier, their hearts full of dreams. The gold rush had faded, but Montana City still offered opportunity. They'd built their cabin on the edge of town, planning for the family they'd raise together. Thomas's death from pneumonia had left her alone, carrying their child, with only the kindness of neighbors to rely upon. Mrs. Abernathy from the adjacent property usually checked on her daily, but the storm had kept everyone confined. Eleanor tried to stay calm as she lowered herself to the edge of the bed. The contractions were still far apart, she had time yet. But she was alone, and the fear that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death now threatened to overwhelm her. A sudden pounding at her door startled her. "Who would be out in such weather, Mrs. Harrington? Are you in there?" A deep voice called over the howling wind. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and made her way carefully to the front door, one hand supporting her belly, the other braced against the wall. She opened it to find a tall figure, covered in snow, standing on her porch. "Vaughn Barrett?" she asked, recognizing the cowboy who worked at the Rockingham Ranch outside town. His dark hair was dusted with snow, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. "Mrs. Abernathy was worried when she couldn't get to you," he explained, stomping snow from his boots. Asked if someone would check. He stopped abruptly, noticing her pained expression as another contraction began. "Madam, are you all right?" Eleanor clutched the doorframe. "The baby," she managed. "It's coming." Vaughn's blue eyes widened with alarm. At 32, he'd broken wild horses, faced down rustlers, and survived a Sioux attack, but the prospect of a woman in labor clearly terrified him more than any of those things. "Let me help you sit down," he said, guiding her to a chair near the fire. "When did it start?" "Just an hour ago," Eleanor said, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "The pains are still far apart." Vaughn removed his snow-covered coat and hat, revealing a lean, weathered face and eyes that betrayed genuine concern. "Do you have someone to help you? A midwife, Mrs. Peterson from town usually attends births, but she can't possibly get here in this," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the window where snow continued to fall in thick curtains. "Dr. Morrison lives in town, but I'll get him," Vaughn said simply. Eleanor stared at him. "That's impossible. The snow must be 4 feet deep in places. No horse could make it through." "Midnight can," Vaughn replied, mentioning his black stallion. "And we don't have much choice, do we?" Another contraction, sharper than the last, answered his question. Eleanor breathed through it, clutching the arms of the chair. When it passed, she looked up to see Vaughn studying her with concern. "You can't go back out in that," she protested. "It's suicide." "I've ridden through worse," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Let me get you comfortable first." Vaughn moved with unexpected efficiency, stoking the fire higher, filling the kettle, and helping Eleanor to her bed. He arranged pillows behind her back and placed extra blankets within reach. "Is there a neighbor nearby who could stay with you?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "The closest is Mrs. Abernathy, and she's nearly 70. I couldn't ask her to come through this." Vaughn hesitated, clearly uncomfortable leaving her alone, but they both understood the stakes. "I'll be back with the doctor as quickly as I can," he promised, already pulling his coat back on. Eleanor caught his hand. "Mr. Barrett, thank you." His expression softened. "Vaughn, please, and there's no need for thanks." He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Keep warm. Try not to worry." As he stepped back out into the storm, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She barely knew Vaughn Barrett. Their interactions had been limited to polite nods when he came to town for supplies. She knew only that he was respected as a hard worker and skilled horseman at the Rockingham Ranch, where he'd worked for the past 5 years. He kept to himself mostly, and there were whispers about a tragedy in his past, though Eleanor had never paid much attention to gossip. Now, this near stranger had become her only hope. Outside, Vaughn fought his way through the blinding snow to the small lean-to where he'd left Midnight. The black stallion nickered softly at his approach. "Sorry, boy," Vaughn murmured, patting the horse's neck. "No rest for us yet." He'd come to check on Eleanor Harrington as a favor to Mrs. Abernathy, never expecting to find a woman in labor. Since arriving in Montana Territory 7 years ago, Vaughn had deliberately kept his distance from the townspeople, especially women. The memories of his fiancée, Sarah's death back in Nebraska, still haunted him, though the sharpest edges of grief had dulled with time. But there was something about Eleanor Harrington that had caught his attention even before today. Her quiet dignity in the face of her husband's death. The way she smiled at children in town, despite her own obvious grief, these things had not gone unnoticed by him. Now, the thought of her facing childbirth alone in this storm was unthinkable. Vaughn mounted Midnight and urged him forward into the teeth of the blizzard. The wind cut like knives, and snow immediately plastered itself to man and horse. The journey to town normally took 30 minutes at a canter. In these conditions, Vaughn estimated it would take at least 2 hours if they could make it at all. "Come on, boy," he encouraged, leaning low over Midnight's neck. "We've got lives depending on us." Back in the cabin, Eleanor tried to prepare as best she could. She placed clean linens nearby, positioned a basin of water close to the fire to stay warm, and laid out what few baby clothes she had ready. The contractions were coming more regularly now, though still not close enough to signal imminent birth. She touched the small gold locket around her neck, containing a lock of Thomas's hair. "I wish you were here," she whispered. "I'm so afraid." As twilight deepened outside, the howling wind seemed to intensify. Eleanor moved around as much as she could between contractions, knowing that movement might help the labor progress. She tried not to watch the clock or wonder if Vaughn Barrett had made it to town, or if he and his horse had become lost in the blinding snow. Vaughn, meanwhile, was fighting for every foot of progress. Midnight plunged bravely through drifts that sometimes reached his chest, but their pace was agonizingly slow. Several times, Vaughn was forced to dismount and break trail on foot, leading the exhausted horse behind him. An hour into the journey, he paused to get his bearings. The snow was so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead, but he knew these lands well. The lights of Montana City should be visible from this ridge if one could see anything at all in the storm. "Just a bit further," he told Midnight, patting the horse's ice-crusted neck. His own hands had long since gone numb, despite his heavy gloves. His face felt frozen behind the scarf wrapped around his lower features. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, Vaughn felt a surge of relief. Most buildings were dark, their occupants wisely staying inside, but he could make out a light burning in Dr. Morrison's office at the end of the main street. Vaughn dismounted stiffly and pounded on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal Edward Morrison, a gray-haired man in his 50s who'd been Montana City's physician for nearly 20 years. Vaughn Barrett. "Good Lord, man, what are you doing out in this?" The doctor pulled him inside. "Mrs. Harrington," Vaughn managed through chattering teeth. "Her baby's coming. She's alone." Dr. Morrison's expression turned grave. "Eleanor Harrington, Thomas's widow." When Vaughn nodded, the doctor moved quickly, gathering supplies into his medical bag. "How far along is her labor?" "Contractions may be 20 minutes apart when I left," Vaughn said, warming his hands by the doctor's stove. "That was almost 2 hours ago." The doctor shook his head. "First babies often take their time, but we should hurry all the same." He looked out at the continuing storm. "Though I'm not sure how we'll get there. My horse couldn't make it through this." "Midnight can carry us both," Vaughn said, though he knew asking more of his already exhausted horse was pushing the limits of the animal's endurance. "We'll take my sleigh," Dr. Morrison decided. "It's in the livery. Your horse can pull it, and the runners might handle these drifts better than wheels would." It took them precious time to retrieve the sleigh and harness Midnight to it. The horse was clearly tired but responded to Vaughn's gentle encouragement. They loaded the sleigh with extra blankets and the doctor's supplies. "I've delivered hundreds of babies," Dr. Morrison said as they set off, "but never in conditions like these." Vaughn didn't respond, focusing instead on guiding Midnight through the treacherous conditions. The return journey seemed even more difficult, with the wind now driving directly into their faces. Several times, they had to stop to dig the sleigh out of particularly deep drifts. At the cabin, Eleanor had moved to the floor, finding it easier to rock on her hands and knees during the increasingly painful contractions. They were coming about 15 minutes apart now, each one more intense than the last. She tried to remember what her mother had told her about childbirth and what she'd observed helping Mrs. Peterson with other births in town. "You can do this," she told herself firmly, though tears of pain and fear streaked her face. "Women have been doing this forever." But most women weren't alone in a blizzard, she thought. A particularly strong contraction gripped her, forcing a cry from her lips. As it eased, she thought she heard something above the wind, the sound of voices. She struggled to her feet and made her way to the window, wiping away condensation to peer into the darkness. Through the swirling snow, she could just make out the shape of a sleigh approaching, a dark horse in front, and 2 bundled figures aboard. Relief washed over her so strongly that her knees nearly buckled. By the time she made it to the door, Vaughn was already helping Dr. Morrison through the deep snow of the yard. Both men were nearly unrecognizable, covered in snow and ice. "Thank God," Eleanor breathed as they stamped onto the porch. "Mrs. Harrington," Dr. Morrison said briskly, brushing past her, "let's get you examined." Vaughn hung back, suddenly uncertain of his place now that the doctor was here. "I'll see to the horse," he said, turning back toward the storm. "The lean-to's around the side," Eleanor called after him before another contraction seized her, and Dr. Morrison guided her back inside. After settling Midnight with the last of the oats from his saddlebag, Vaughn hesitated. Should he leave? The doctor was here now, and his presence in the cabin during such a private time would be inappropriate. But the thought of riding back to the ranch in the continuing storm was daunting, and he worried about leaving them without help if needed. Decision made, he pushed back into the cabin. "Doctor." Morrison was just emerging from the bedroom. "How is she?" Vaughn asked. "Progressing well," the doctor said, washing his hands in a basin. "First babies usually take their time, but she's strong. It could be a few more hours yet." He gave Vaughn an appraising look. "You look half frozen. Get warm by the fire. I may need your help before this is done." Vaughn removed his outer layers and sank gratefully onto a chair near the hearth. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, exhaustion washed over him. He must have dozed because the next thing he knew, Doctor Morrison was shaking his shoulder. "I need hot water," the doctor said urgently, "and clean towels. Things are moving faster than I expected." Vaughn jumped to his feet, following the doctor's instructions. From the bedroom came Eleanor's pained cries, each one making Vaughn wince in sympathy. "Should I go outside?" he asked uncertainly as he handed the doctor a stack of clean linens. Dr. Morrison looked harried. "Actually, I could use another pair of hands. She's struggling and I need someone to help support her." Vaughn swallowed hard but nodded. He'd never attended a birth before, but he'd helped deliver foals and calves. How different could it be? Very different, as it turned out. Eleanor lay propped against pillows, her face flushed with exertion, hair damp with sweat. She looked startled to see Vaughn enter behind the doctor. "Mr. Barrett," she began, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I need him to help, Eleanor," Dr. Morrison said firmly. "Now, when the next contraction comes, I want you to push, just as I showed you." Vaughn moved to the head of the bed, uncertain what to do. "Support her back," the doctor instructed. "Let her brace against you when she pushes." Awkwardly, Vaughn positioned himself behind Eleanor, allowing her to lean against his chest. She was rigid with tension and embarrassment. "I'm sorry about this," she whispered. "Don't be," he said gently. "Just focus on what you need to do." When the next contraction came, Eleanor grabbed his hand with surprising strength. Vaughn held her steady as she pushed, murmuring encouragement, though he had no idea if he was saying the right things. For the next hour, they fell into a rhythm. Contraction, push, rest. Vaughn wiped Eleanor's forehead with a cool cloth between pains, held water to her lips, and provided the physical support she needed to continue. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he told her truthfully after a particularly difficult contraction. Eleanor managed a weak smile, too exhausted for embarrassment now. "I doubt that very much. I've seen men crumble under far less pain," Vaughn insisted. "You're doing amazingly." "I can see the head," Dr. Morrison announced suddenly. "One more good push, Eleanor." Eleanor gathered her remaining strength, gripping Vaughn's hands as she bore down with a cry that turned into a sob of relief as her child slipped into the world. The thin, indignant wail of a newborn filled the cabin. "A boy," Dr. Morrison announced, quickly wrapping the infant in a clean towel. "A fine, healthy boy." He placed the baby on Eleanor's chest, and she cradled him with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Vaughn looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant and felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. "Hello, Thomas," Eleanor whispered to her son, naming him for his father. Vaughn began to withdraw, feeling suddenly like an intruder on this sacred moment, but Eleanor caught his hand. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "We would not have survived without you. You did all the hard work," he demurred. Dr. Morrison chuckled. "Indeed she did, but your ride through that blizzard likely saved 2 lives tonight, Barrett. Don't minimize that." Later, after the doctor had tended to Eleanor and the baby and all 3 were resting, Vaughn built up the fire and made coffee. The storm continued unabated outside, the wind occasionally rattling the windows with particular force. "We won't be going anywhere tonight, Doctor," Morrison said, accepting a cup of coffee. "Probably not tomorrow either, from the sound of it." Vaughn nodded, looking toward the bedroom where Eleanor and her son slept. "Will they be all right, barring any complications?" "Yes. She's young and healthy, and the boy has a good set of lungs on him." The doctor studied Vaughn over his spectacles. "That was quite a risk you took today," Vaughn shrugged. "Anyone would have done the same." "I doubt that very much," Dr. Morrison said dryly. Not many men would have attempted that ride, and fewer would have succeeded. He paused. I delivered Eleanor, you know, and Thomas before her, known her family for years. You delivered her? Vaughn asked, surprised. Indeed. Her parents were among the first settlers here. Good people. The doctor sighed. She's had more than her share of sorrow lately. Losing Thomas like that and now facing motherhood alone. Vaughn nodded, unsure what to say. He'd kept his distance from the townspeople precisely to avoid conversations like this, discussions of personal histories and connections. She'll have help, the doctor continued. This community looks after its own, but it won't be easy for her. No, Vaughn agreed quietly. It won't be. They fell silent, listening to the storm. Eventually, Dr. Morrison dozed off in his chair, leaving Vaughn alone with his thoughts. He found himself reflecting on the events of the day, on the fierce courage he'd witnessed in Eleanor Harrington, and on the strange twist of fate that had placed him in the middle of this intensely personal moment in her life. When a soft cry came from the bedroom, Vaughn rose quickly, hoping to reach the baby before his cries woke Eleanor. He found Thomas fussing in the small cradle beside the bed. Eleanor was still sleeping deeply, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Hesitantly, Vaughn lifted the infant, remembering how the ranch foreman's wife had shown him to hold her babies. The tiny boy quieted almost immediately, staring up at Vaughn with unfocused eyes. "Hello there," Vaughn whispered. "Your mama's resting. She worked very hard to bring you into this world." He carried Thomas into the main room, settling into the rocking chair near the fire. The baby made small, snuffling sounds but seemed content in Vaughn's arms. "You picked quite a night to arrive," Vaughn told him softly. "But I suppose that's fitting for a boy born in Montana territory. You'll grow up strong here." Dr. Morrison opened one eye. "You've a natural way with him," he observed. Vaughn felt himself flush. "Just letting his mother rest." The doctor hummed, closing his eye again. "Eleanor will need help when we leave. That storm's likely to keep the town isolated for days." Vaughn looked down at the sleeping infant. "I can bring supplies from the ranch when it's safe to travel. Make sure they have enough firewood." "Good man, Doctor," Morrison murmured, already drifting back to sleep. The blizzard continued for 2 more days, keeping them all confined to the small cabin. During that time, a strange sort of intimacy developed between the 3 adults and the infant. "Doctor." Morrison showed Eleanor how to nurse Thomas and care for herself after the birth. Vaughn kept the fire blazing, prepared simple meals, and even awkwardly held Thomas when Eleanor needed rest. On the morning of the 3rd day, they awoke to silence. The wind had finally stopped. Vaughn opened the door to find a transformed world, blindingly white under a clear blue sky. Drifts reached nearly to the cabin's windows in places. "It'll be a while before the roads are passable," Dr. Morrison observed, coming to stand beside him. "But I should try to get back to town today. There may be others needing medical attention after such a storm." Eleanor, who'd been listening from the doorway of the bedroom Thomas cradled in her arms, looked alarmed. "How will you manage?" "The sleigh should handle it, now that the winds died down," the doctor replied. "Though I hate to leave you alone so soon." "I'll stay," Vaughn said, the words surprising even himself. "At least until someone from town can check on her." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Mr. Barrett, you've done more than enough. Surely they'll be missing you at the ranch." "Jeb knows I got caught in the storm," Vaughn said, referring to the ranch foreman. "He won't expect me until the snow clears enough for riding. Besides, you shouldn't be chopping wood or carrying water yet." Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. "He's right, Eleanor. You need to rest and focus on the baby." Eleanor looked like she wanted to argue but then glanced down at Thomas and nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. After helping the doctor prepare for his journey, loading the sleigh with enough provisions to see him through if he got stranded, Vaughn found himself truly alone with Eleanor and her newborn for the first time. An awkward silence fell between them as they watched the sleigh disappear down the snow-covered road. "You really don't have to stay," Eleanor said finally. "We'll manage." "I know you would," Vaughn replied. "You're obviously capable. But there's no sense in you straining yourself when I'm able to help." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate it, truly, though I'm afraid I'm poor company right now." "I don't need entertaining," Vaughn assured her. "Just tell me what needs doing." They settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine over the next few days. Vaughn took care of the physical tasks, keeping the fire stoked, bringing in wood, melting snow for water, and preparing simple meals. Eleanor focused on Thomas, who proved to be a contented baby when his basic needs were met. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in companionable silence. Vaughn found himself sharing stories of his work at the ranch, of the characters he'd met in his years in Montana territory. Eleanor, in turn, spoke of her life before Thomas's death, their journey west, their dreams for the future. "He would have been so proud of his son," she said one evening, watching Thomas sleep in her arms. "He wanted children so much." "He'd be proud of you, too," Vaughn said quietly. "The way you've faced all this." Eleanor looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sometimes I'm not sure how I'll manage alone. Raising a boy needs a father." "You'll find your way," Vaughn assured her, "and you won't be alone. As the doctor said, this community looks after its own." "You're part of this community too, you know," Eleanor said. "Even if you keep to yourself at that ranch," Vaughn shifted uncomfortably. "I prefer the quiet." "There's a story there," Eleanor observed gently. Vaughn stared into the fire for a long moment. "There was a woman back in Nebraska," he said finally. "Sarah, we were to be married." Eleanor waited silently, sensing there was more. "There was an outbreak of diphtheria. She was a teacher exposed to the children." He swallowed hard. "I couldn't save her. After, I couldn't stay there. Too many memories." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered. Vaughn nodded, not trusting himself to speak further. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in memories of those they'd lost. "It gets easier," Eleanor said eventually. "Not better exactly, but the pain becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you." Vaughn looked at her with new respect. "That's wisely put. My mother said it after my father died. I didn't understand it then." She smoothed Thomas's wispy hair. "I'm beginning to now." The next morning they heard the welcome sound of horses approaching. Mrs. Abernathy and her son had managed to get through with a wagon, bringing supplies and news from town. "Oh, my dear girl," Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed, embracing Eleanor carefully around the baby. "When Mr. Barrett didn't return and then Dr. Morrison came back alone, we were so worried. But he told us everything turned out well, thank the Lord." Her sharp eyes took in Vaughn's presence, but she made no comment beyond thanking him for his help. Her son James unloaded supplies while Mrs. Abernathy cooed over Thomas and caught Eleanor up on the town news. "We've cleared the main roads," James told Vaughn. "You should be able to make it back to the Rockingham now if you're wanting to go." Vaughn nodded, aware of a strange reluctance at the thought of leaving. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet evenings by the fire, to Eleanor's thoughtful conversation, to the weight of baby Thomas in his arms. Eleanor approached as James returned to the wagon. "It seems you're free to go," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "It seems so," Vaughn agreed, equally careful. "Will you be all right? Mrs. Abernathy can't stay all day, I'm guessing." "I'll manage," Eleanor said, then hesitated. "But perhaps You might check on us sometimes if your work allows." Something warm unfurled in Vaughn's chest. "I'd like that," he said simply. True to his word, Vaughn returned to Eleanor's cabin 3 days later, bringing fresh venison from a deer he'd shot. He found her looking tired but happy, the cabin spotless despite her having a newborn to care for. "You should be resting more," he chided gently, taking Thomas from her arms so she could sit. "Says the man who rode through a blizzard," she retorted, but she sank gratefully onto the sofa. Vaughn's visits became regular twice a week at first, then more frequently as the winter wore on. He brought supplies, chopped endless cords of firewood, and repaired things around the cabin that Thomas had left undone before his death. The townspeople noticed, of course. Montana City was too small for secrets. But if there was gossip about the solitary cowboy spending so much time with the young widow, it didn't reach Eleanor's ears. And if Jeb at the Rocking M raised an eyebrow when Vaughn requested more time away from the ranch, he kept his questions to himself. As winter gradually loosened its grip on the valley, Thomas grew and thrived. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's cleft chin, and a smile that could light up the darkest day. Vaughn found himself increasingly enchanted by the baby and increasingly drawn to his mother. Eleanor, too, found herself looking forward to Vaughn's visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and troubled her. Was it too soon to feel this way about another man? Was she dishonoring Thomas's memory? "You're young, Mrs. Abernathy told her firmly when Eleanor hesitantly voiced these concerns. "Thomas would want you to be happy, to give that boy a father. Vaughn hasn't." "There's been no indication that he sees me that way," Eleanor protested, flushing. Mrs. Abernathy had merely raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That man doesn't ride 5 miles through spring mud just to fix your porch steps, my dear." As the snow melted and wildflowers began to dot the hillsides, Eleanor found herself emerging from the fog of grief that had enveloped her since Thomas's death. She would always love and miss her first husband, but she was beginning to believe that life might still hold joy for her and Thomas. Vaughn, meanwhile, struggled with his growing feelings for Eleanor. The walls he'd built around his heart since Sarah's death were crumbling, and it terrified him. Eleanor deserved someone whole, not a man still haunted by old ghosts. Besides, she was still mourning Thomas. The last thing she needed was unwelcome attention from him. These thoughts were circling in his mind one April afternoon as he repaired a loose board on Eleanor's front steps. Thomas, now 4 months old and growing rapidly, lay on a blanket nearby, gurgling happily in the spring sunshine. Eleanor emerged from the cabin with 2 glasses of lemonade. "You're frowning fit to frighten the crows," she observed, handing him a glass. "Is the step giving you trouble?" "Not the step," Vaughn admitted, taking a long drink. Eleanor settled beside Thomas on the blanket. "Want to talk about it?" Vaughn hesitated, then set aside his tools and joined them. Thomas immediately grabbed for his finger with surprising strength. "He likes you," Eleanor said, smiling. "The feeling's mutual," Vaughn replied, gently bouncing the baby's fist. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, enjoying the warm afternoon. In the distance, the mountains were still snow-capped, but the valley was coming alive with the promise of spring. "I've been offered a job," Vaughn said suddenly. "A ranch in Wyoming, good position, foreman." Eleanor felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her. "Oh," she managed, "that's wonderful. When would you go?" "I haven't accepted," Vaughn said, not meeting her eyes, "just considering it." "Why wouldn't you accept? It sounds like a good opportunity." Vaughn looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race at what she saw in his eyes. "There are reasons to stay," he said quietly. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Such as?" "You know, such as," Vaughn replied, his voice barely above a whisper. But I have no right to speak of it. You're still grieving. And Thomas would want me to be happy, Eleanor interrupted. And Thomas, our Thomas, deserves a father who will love him. She took a deep breath. If that's what you're offering, Vaughn's expression softened. I already love him, he admitted. And his mother, she's the bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, even covered in spit up and with circles under my eyes. Especially then, Vaughn said, reaching out to brush a tear from her cheek. I thought I'd never feel this way again after Sarah. Never wanted to, but you and Thomas, you've changed that. And you saved us, Eleanor said softly. Not just that night in the blizzard, every day since. Vaughn moved closer, his hand still gentle on her face. I'd very much like to kiss you, he said, if that wouldn't be unwelcome. In answer, Eleanor leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening with shared emotion. When they finally parted, both were breathing unsteadily. I think that's a no on Wyoming, Vaughn said, a smile spreading across his face. I think you're right, Eleanor agreed, unable to stop smiling herself. Thomas chose that moment to let out a loud squeal, waving his arms excitedly. See. He approves, Vaughn laughed, lifting the baby into his arms. Their courtship progressed with the changing seasons. Vaughn continued living at the Rockingham, but he spent most of his free time with Eleanor and Thomas. By midsummer, all of Montana City had accepted them as a couple, and few remembered a time when Vaughn Barrett had been the solitary, somber cowboy who kept to himself. They were married in September, when Thomas was 9 months old. It was a simple ceremony in the town's small church, attended by most of the community. Mrs. Abernathy cried openly, declaring that she'd known all along they were perfect for each other. Vaughn sold his horse Midnight to the Rockingham, using the money as a down payment on a small piece of land adjoining Eleanor's property. There, with the help of neighbors, he built an addition to the cabin, giving them a larger home for their growing family. On the first anniversary of Thomas's birth, as a fresh blanket of snow covered Montana City, Eleanor and Vaughn stood by the window, watching the flakes fall. Not quite the blizzard of last year, Vaughn observed, his arm around Eleanor's waist. Thank goodness for that, she replied, leaning into him. Thomas was asleep in his new room, exhausted from a day of celebration. You ever wonder, Vaughn asked hesitantly, what would have happened if it hadn't stormed that day? If someone else had checked on you? Eleanor turned in his arms. I believe we would have found each other anyway, she said firmly. Some things are meant to be. Vaughn kissed her then, still marveling at how this woman and her son had broken through the armor around his heart. Besides, Eleanor added with a smile when they parted, we have a new storm to weather in about 7 months. It took Vaughn a moment to understand her meaning. When he did, his face lit up with joy. You're certain? Eleanor nodded, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. Doctor Morrison confirmed it yesterday. Vaughn pulled her into a fierce embrace. I love you, he whispered against her hair. Both of you, all of you. And we love you, Eleanor replied, our cowboy who braved the storm. As they stood together watching the snow fall, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The grief and loss that had nearly overwhelmed her, the blizzard that had threatened her and Thomas's lives, and the brave man who had risked everything to save them. A man who had become father to her son, and now would be father to another child. Life in Montana territory was never easy. There would be more storms to weather, more challenges to face. But they would face them together. This family forged in the teeth of a blizzard, bound by love that had come unexpectedly but grown stronger with each passing day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentler than on that fateful night a year ago, but a reminder nonetheless of how quickly life could change, how blessing could emerge from hardship, and how love could bloom even in the harshest conditions. The following summer brought the birth of their daughter, Emily, a bright-eyed, strong-lunged baby who had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she took her first breath. Unlike Thomas's dramatic arrival, Emily was born on a calm June morning with Dr. Morrison attending and Mrs. Abernathy assisting. Vaughn paced nervously outside until the doctor called him in to meet his daughter. Thomas, now 18 months old and toddling everywhere, was fascinated by his baby sister. "Be gentle," Vaughn reminded him, guiding the little boy's hand as he patted Emily's dark hair. "She has your eyes," Eleanor told Vaughn from her bed, watching her husband cradle their newborn daughter. "And your spirit, I'm guessing," Vaughn replied with a smile. "Listen to those lungs." Their family drew notice in Montana City, the widow who'd found love again with the solitary cowboy, their two beautiful children. But what most remarked upon was the obvious devotion between Vaughn and Eleanor, and their shared dedication to their growing family. Vaughn proved to be a natural father, patient with Thomas's toddler energy and gentle with Emily's infant needs. The skills that made him an excellent horseman, calm steadiness, quiet authority, and endless patience translated well to parenthood. If he sometimes woke in the night, heart racing with fear at the thought of losing this precious family as he'd lost Sarah years before, he kept those fears to himself, reassured by Eleanor's warm presence beside him. For her part, Eleanor blossomed as a wife and mother. The strength she'd found during her darkest days, widowed and alone, giving birth during a blizzard, became the foundation of her character. She was respected in the community, sought after for her calm advice, and admired for her resilience. As Montana Territory moved toward statehood, their little family grew and thrived. Vaughn continued working at the Rockingham while developing their own small ranch. By the time Emily was 2, they had a respectable herd of cattle, 2 milk cows, chickens, and half a dozen horses, including a gentle pony for Thomas. Life wasn't without its hardships. A drought the summer Emily turned 3 nearly wiped out their crops. The winter after, a sickness swept through Montana City, claiming several lives, including dear Mrs. Abernathy. Thomas broke his arm falling from the hayloft, and Vaughn injured his back helping a neighbor raise a barn. But through it all, their love remained steadfast. The passion that had ignited during those quiet evenings by the fire in Eleanor's cabin had deepened into something unshakable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and abiding affection. On cold winter nights, they still spoke sometimes of that first blizzard, of Vaughn's desperate ride through the storm, and of tiny Thomas's arrival into the world. Those memories had taken on an almost mythic quality, a founding story for their family that they would pass down through generations. "Did you ever imagine, that day you came to check on me, that we'd end up here?" Eleanor asked Vaughn one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Thomas and Emily play in the yard. "Not in my wildest dreams," Vaughn admitted, taking her hand. "I just wanted to make sure you were safe." "My hero," Eleanor teased gently. Vaughn shook his head. "You were your own hero that day," he said seriously. "I just fetched the doctor." "Through a blizzard on a half-wild horse, risking your life," Eleanor reminded him. "Let me have my romantic version." Vaughn laughed and pulled her closer. "As you wish, Mrs. Barrett." They watched their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Thomas protective of his little sister even as he encouraged her adventures. Soon they would call the children in for supper, listen to their prayers, and tuck them into bed. Then Eleanor and Vaughn would have a few quiet hours together before another busy day on their ranch. It was a good life, richer and fuller than either had dared hope for during their darkest days. A life built on courage, perseverance, and the love that had blossomed between a widow and a cowboy during the worst blizzard in Montana City's history. And as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor and Vaughn Barrett held hands on their porch, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the love that would sustain them through all the seasons to come. Years passed, and Montana achieved statehood in 1889. The Barrett Ranch prospered under Vaughn and Eleanor's careful stewardship. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who inherited his mother's quiet strength and his father's affinity for horses. Emily became a spirited girl with a quick mind and quicker tongue, determined to attend college despite the rarity of women pursuing higher education. When Thomas was 16, Eleanor gave birth to another son, Matthew, a surprise blessing that brought renewed joy to their household. By then, their original cabin had been replaced by a comfortable two-story home built by Vaughn and his neighbors over the course of 2 summers. Montana City grew as well, though it never became the bustling metropolis its founders had envisioned. The railroad brought new settlers, new opportunities, and new challenges. Through it all, the Barretts remained a respected family in the community, known for their hard work, generosity in times of need, and the enduring love story that had begun in a blizzard. On the 20th anniversary of that fateful storm, Vaughn surprised Eleanor with a gold locket to replace the simple one that had contained Thomas's father's hair. "Open it," he urged, watching her face. Inside, she found a tiny illustration of their cabin in the snow, meticulously painted by a traveling artist who had stayed with them the previous summer. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, tears in her eyes. "Our beginning. The best decision I ever made was riding out in that storm," Vaughn said, helping her fasten the locket around her neck, "even if I didn't know it at the time." Eleanor touched the locket, then reached for her husband's hand. "Do you remember what you told me that night, after Thomas was born?" "I said a lot of things," Vaughn replied with a smile. "I was rather overwhelmed." "You said I was the strongest person you'd ever met," Eleanor reminded him. "But you were wrong. We're strongest together." Vaughn drew her into his arms, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit there. "Together," he agreed, kissing her softly. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle flakes that would soon cover their ranch in a pristine blanket of white. But inside their home, surrounded by the family they had built, Vaughn and Eleanor Barrett were warm, safe, and still deeply in love, a love born in a blizzard and tempered through years of shared joy and sorrow. A love that would endure as long as the mountains stood guard over the valley they called home. And in years to come, when their grandchildren begged for the story, they would tell of a desperate ride through a howling storm, of a baby born as snow piled high against the cabin walls, and of 2 hearts finding each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. It was their legacy, a testament to courage and compassion, and to the transformative power of love that could turn even the darkest blizzard into the brightest blessing.